The moonflowers were braided into Celine's hair by hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Her mother, Myra, kept adjusting the same strand of dark hair over and over, not because it needed fixing, but because her hands didn't know what else to do. Celine watched her in the mirror. The preparation chamber smelled of jasmine oil and candle smoke. Around them, 12 other unbonded females chattered and laughed, their voices bright as bells, their eyes glowing with the kind of excitement that Celine had once believed she might feel someday. She did not feel it tonight. What she felt was something closer to the sensation of standing at the edge of a very high cliff, knowing she was going to be pushed, just not knowing exactly when. "You look beautiful," Myra whispered. It was the wrong thing to say. Celine knew her mother meant well. She knew the woman beside her was also suffering in her own quiet, swallowed-down way. But beautiful felt like a cruel word tonight. Beautiful was the thing that had made Dorian Creed notice her at the harvest gathering last autumn. Beautiful was the reason Beta Harkin had suggested the arrangement to her father. Beautiful had become a liability, not a gift. "Mema," Celine said softly, keeping her voice below the noise of the other women. "Please. Can we talk about this one more time? There has to be something else we can do." Myra's hands stilled in her hair. The silence between them stretched like taffy, thin and sweet on the surface and aching underneath. "There isn't," her mother finally said. Her voice had gone flat in the way it did when she'd already cried everything out in private and had nothing left. "Your father's debts are not small things anymore, Celine. They never were. And Dorian Creed is the only man whose family has offered to absorb them. If you refuse tonight. I know what happens if I refuse. Then you know we lose the house. You know your sisters won't have dowries. You know your brother can't take his apprenticeship without the funds that—" "I know," Celine said again, quieter this time. She knew every consequence by heart. She'd lain awake memorizing them for 3 months, stacking them against her fear like weights on a scale, telling herself the fear was smaller. She almost believed it on good days. Tonight was not a good day. She thought about the last time Dorian had gotten her alone. It had been a market afternoon, 2 weeks ago, sunlight and vendors and the smell of roasting corn on the air. Perfectly ordinary. He'd steered her behind a cloth merchant's stall with the ease of someone who knew she wouldn't make a scene, and he'd gripped her wrist until she felt the small bones compress beneath his fingers. Not hard enough to break anything. Just hard enough that she'd understand. "After tonight," he'd said, smiling, "you'll stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" She'd managed. "Like you're afraid of me." A pause. "Because you'll have learned there's nothing to do about it, so you might as well not bother." The bruise had yellowed and faded since then. But the words hadn't. "No tears," Myra said now, stepping back to look at Celine's reflection. Her mother's own eyes were glassy. The irony of that instruction seemed lost on her entirely. "You represent our family tonight. Compose yourself." And then she was gone, swept into a conversation with another mother near the doorway, and Celine was left alone in a crowded room, staring at a girl in the mirror she barely recognized. The girl looking back wore ceremonial white, which was meant to symbolize new beginnings. The moonflowers in her dark hair were meant to symbolize favor from the moon goddess herself, the ancient Lycan deity who supposedly blessed bonded pairs and guided true mates to one another. The whole ceremony was built on the idea of sacred, chosen love. Celine thought there was something almost obscene about wearing moonflowers to a transaction. She pressed her palm flat against the dressing table and breathed. In through her nose, out through her mouth, the way Lyra had taught her when the anxiety got loud. Lyra, her closest friend, who was currently standing somewhere in the crowd outside, who had pressed Celine's hand this afternoon and said, "I'll be watching. I'll be right there." As if Lyra's presence could somehow make any of this survivable. Maybe it would. Celine held on to that. The tears started somewhere around the time the ceremony bells began to ring outside, 3 long, resonant tones that drifted through the chamber walls and announced that the bonding moon rite was beginning. Not a dramatic sob. Just the slow, relentless kind of crying that happens when a person has run out of ways to fight the feeling. A single tear first, then another, and then she stopped counting. She blotted them quickly, uselessly. They kept coming. "Stop it," she told herself. Stop it, You cannot walk out there like this, you will embarrass everyone, you will ruin it, stop. But grief doesn't negotiate. It simply arrives. By the time Dorian appeared at the chamber entrance to collect her, her cheeks were wet. He took one look at her and his jaw tightened. "You're crying," he said, low and flat. "I know. I'm sorry, I'll fix it." He took her arm. Not gently. "Before anyone sees." But it was too late for that. They were already moving toward the ceremony ground, already entering the great torchlit circle where hundreds of pack members had gathered under the full moon. The air smelled of night-blooming jasmine and old magic. Lanterns swayed softly in the trees. It was, objectively, the most beautiful night Celine had seen in years. She kept her chin tucked down and let Dorian's grip steer her. She was thinking about her twin sisters, 8 years old, who still believed their older sister was brave. She was thinking that she could do this. That people survived worse. She was thinking she should stop crying before anyone important saw her. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that someone already had. At the north edge of the great circle, raised on a stone dais carved with the ancient Ashbourne crest, stood King Zarel Ashbourne. He was not a man who made people comfortable simply by existing. It wasn't intentional. It was simply the nature of being what he was, the Lycan king, alpha of all alphas, 34 years old and ruling in a way that was equal parts iron and fairness. He wasn't cruel. His pack respected him genuinely, not only out of fear. But his presence was the kind that filled a room the way a thunderstorm fills a sky. You felt it before you saw the lightning. Tonight he stood still at the edge of the dais, watching the couples file into the circle below him, doing what he always did at the bonding moon rite. Witnessing. Presiding. Offering the ceremonial blessing that would open the sacred hour. Going home alone afterward to chambers that echoed. He was 34. He had presided over 9 bonding moon rites. He had watched hundreds of couples complete their mate bonds under the full moon, had felt the ancient magic pulse through the clearing each time a mark was given, had spoken the blessing words so many times he sometimes heard them in his sleep. His own bond had never formed. He'd stopped saying that part out loud years ago because people gave him a particular look when he did, half pity, half discomfort, the expression of someone who doesn't know what to do with a fact that shouldn't be a fact. Lycan kings were supposed to have mates. The moon goddess was supposed to provide. It was simply the way of things. Apparently no one had told the moon goddess. Beta Harkin Creed appeared at the edge of the dais, bowing. A broad man with a politician's smile and small, watching eyes. "Your Majesty. 21 couples bonding tonight. Including my son." "Marcus," Zarel said, and then corrected himself. He'd misread the name on the ceremony scroll. "Dorian." "Dorian, yes." Harkin's chest puffed slightly. "His chosen the Nightingale girl. Celine Voss, technically, her mother remarried. Good bloodline, though her father has had some financial troubles. Dorian has been very generous in overlooking it." Generous. Zarel heard the word and something in him, his wolf, that deep instinctual part of himself that rarely stirred at mere conversation, went very, very still. "Generous," he repeated. "Indeed. The girl will make a fine mate for him. She's quiet. Biddable." Harkin smiled. "Dorian appreciates that quality." Zarel said nothing. He turned back to the circle. And that was the moment he saw her. She was entering from the far end, her dark hair braided with moonflowers, white dress catching the torchlight. She was beautiful, that registered distantly, but it wasn't the beauty that stopped him cold. It was the way her chin was tucked down. The way her shoulders had curved inward like she was trying to take up less space in the universe. The way the light caught the unmistakable silver tracks of tears on her cheeks. And the man beside her, Dorian Creed, had his hand around her arm in a grip that was not affection. The mate bond, which had been dormant inside Zarel for 34 years, snapped open like a door blown off its hinges. It wasn't gradual. There was no slow warmth, no gentle recognition. It was a lightning strike, immediate and total, reshaping everything in a single instant. His vision went silver at the edges. His wolf came surging forward with a sound like the word mine turned into something primal and furious. "Ours," his wolf corrected. "Ours. And she is crying." And that man's hand. Your Majesty, Harkin was saying something. Zarel was no longer listening. He was watching Dorian Creed lean down and say something in the girl's ear, his mate's ear, and watching her go rigid with the effort of not flinching. Watching her press her lips together and fail to stop the next tear. Something ancient and absolute settled over Zarel Ashbourne then. Not a decision exactly. More like the recognition of something that had already been decided by powers older than him. He descended from the dais. The ceremony master looked up in alarm. Every Lycan in the clearing felt the shift in alpha energy and went quiet, instinctively, the way animals go quiet before a storm. The laughter stopped. The music stopped. The soft murmur of 200 voices died completely. And in that sudden, enormous silence, the king of the Northern Territories walked across the circle, not to the dais, not to the ceremony stone, not to any position the ancient rite prescribed, but directly, with absolute certainty, toward a crying girl in a white dress who had no idea he was coming. The clearing had never been this quiet in Celine's memory. Not the comfortable quiet of reverence, the kind that settles over a crowd during sacred moments. This was the held-breath quiet of 200 people watching something happen that they didn't have words for yet. Celine felt the shift before she understood it, a change in the air, the way pressure changes before a storm rolls in from the mountains. The couple beside her stopped whispering mid-sentence. The ceremony master's bell went still in his hand. Dorian's grip on her arm tightened. That was how she knew something was wrong. Or perhaps, though she didn't dare think it yet, something was right. She raised her eyes. The king was walking toward her. Not toward the ceremony stone. Not toward the blessing altar where he was supposed to stand. Toward her. Directly, unhurriedly, with the kind of certainty that belongs to men who have never once in their lives been told to stop and have no memory of what that word feels like. Celine's first thought, absurdly, was that she'd done something wrong. That her crying had been an offense to the ceremony somehow. That the king was coming to remove her from the circle for disgracing the rite. She almost stepped backward. Dorian's grip stopped her. King Zarel Ashbourne was taller up close than he seemed from a distance. Most powerful men were. There was something about the way they occupied space, unhurried and complete, that made them seem one size larger than they actually were. He had dark hair, slightly overgrown, and the kind of face that looked like it had been weathered into its handsomeness rather than born with it. A jaw that held tension. Eyes that were, Celine blinked, silver. Not grey. Not the steely blue-grey she'd seen in portraits. Silver, pure and luminous, like the moon itself had poured into his irises. He stopped directly in front of them. The silence was so complete she could hear the candles flickering in the lanterns above. Release her. 2 words. Quiet enough that only the front row heard the syllables clearly, but the alpha command beneath them rolled out like a wave, something below sound, something felt in the sternum. Celine felt it pass through her like warm water. Dorian felt it differently. His hand dropped from her arm as if he'd touched fire. She heard his sharp intake of breath, the involuntary submission of a lesser wolf to an alpha's direct command. For just a moment, one small, shameful, human moment, Celine felt the absence of his grip like the removal of a splinter she'd gotten so used to she'd forgotten it was there. Your Majesty, Dorian's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the edges of shock in it. I don't understand what. I didn't ask you to understand. Zarel's eyes hadn't moved to Dorian at all. They were on Celine. Entirely and only on Celine, with an intensity that should have frightened her and somehow didn't. Step back, Dorian Creed. Dorian stepped back. Celine stood in the space his absence left, suddenly aware that she had no idea what to do with her hands, no idea where to look. No armor left because she'd spent all of it on the walk across the clearing, and she was standing here with dried tears on her cheeks and moon flowers in her hair and a king looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a turning world. You're trembling, Zarel said. Low, just for her. I know, she whispered. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Something crossed his face. Not anger, not exactly. Something older than anger, more complicated. He glanced down at her arm, at the place where Dorian's hand had been. Are you hurt? The question was so simple. So direct. Celine didn't know what to do with it. No one had asked her that in 3 months. Not her mother, not Lyra, not any of the women who'd noticed her going quiet whenever Dorian's name came up. The question landed somewhere behind her ribs and sat there, heavy and warm. "Not right now," she said carefully. His eyes came back to hers. "That's not quite the same as no." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he did something she did not expect at all. He reached up, slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to step away, and with both thumbs, gently wiped the remaining tears from her cheeks. The touch was so soft she almost didn't believe it was real. A king's hands, she thought distantly, should not be this careful. And yet here was the proof that they could be. The contact sent something electric through her. Not frightening. Something warmer than that. Something that made the frantic noise in her chest go briefly, blessedly quiet. Around them, the crowd had begun to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. She heard the murmur start at the edges and ripple inward. She heard Lyra's voice somewhere in the gathered pack, a single gasped syllable, her name, Celine, and then nothing because the king was speaking again. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to answer me honestly. Not for their sake," he didn't gesture at the crowd. He didn't need to. "For yours. Only yours. Do you understand?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Do you want to bond with Dorian Creed?" The question fell into the quiet like a stone into still water. She heard Dorian make a sound of outrage behind the king. Heard Beta hearken somewhere to the left begin to say "Your Majesty" in the particular tone that men use when they want to sound reasonable and are actually furious. Neither of them finished their sentences. One look from Zarel, unhurried, absolute, silenced the clearing again. Celine looked at the king's face. At those silver eyes, which were watching her with a patience she hadn't expected, a willingness to wait, to let her find the words herself rather than rush her toward any particular answer. She thought about the market. The grip. The bruise that had taken 2 weeks to fade. She thought about the voice in her ear at the entrance to the circle, "After tonight you'll stop looking at me like that," and the smile that had gone with it. She thought about her sisters, 8 years old, who still thought their older sister was brave. Maybe bravery wasn't standing still and absorbing things. Maybe bravery was the 3 seconds of courage it took to say a true thing in front of everyone who expected you to say something else. "No," she said. The word came out barely above a breath, but in that silence it might as well have been a bell. "No, I don't want this. I never wanted this." Her voice shook but kept going, the way a candle flame holds through a gust and comes out steadier on the other side. "He scares me. He has hurt me. I have a bruise on my arm right now, under this sleeve, that he put there 2 weeks ago in the market, and no one," she stopped. Swallowed. No one asked. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Heavier. The kind that contains collective shame. She heard her mother make a broken sound somewhere in the crowd. Zarel's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes went very, very still. The controlled stillness of a man holding something powerful under deliberate restraint. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me that." He turned to address the clearing then, straightening to his full height, his voice shifting from intimate to carrying. "Beta hearken Creed," he didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Your son has been representing this pack and this ceremony with conduct unworthy of both. The arrangement made with the Voss family is hereby dissolved. Any debts held against them are forgiven. I will personally ensure it." Harkin stepped forward, his face red. "Your Majesty," with respect, there was a formal agreement. "My son was promised." "Your son put his hands on an unwilling woman and called it an arrangement." Zarel's voice didn't rise. It dropped, actually, going quieter in the way that is more dangerous than shouting. "If you would like to challenge that characterization, I will make space in my schedule." Harkin went still. Dorian, behind him, said nothing. Celine finally let herself look at Dorian Creed's face, really look, without flinching, and saw something there she hadn't expected. Not the casual cruelty she'd grown used to. Something rawer. Humiliation. And underneath it, the beginning of understanding that something had slipped out of his hands tonight that he would not be getting back. Good, she thought, and was a little surprised by how clean that felt. Zarel turned back to her. The debts are forgiven, he said, for her alone again. You owe nothing to anyone tonight. You are free to go. A pause. Or. She looked at him. Or, her voice was very small. Or, he said, and something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like a layer of king coming down and something truer showing through underneath it. Something almost uncertain. You can feel what I feel. What I've been feeling since the moment I saw you walk into this circle, he exhaled slowly. You're my mate, Celine. The bond formed the moment my eyes found you, completely, instantly, the way I was starting to believe it never would. I have been presiding over this ceremony for 9 years. I have stood on that dais and watched hundreds of people find what I couldn't find. He paused. And then you walked in, crying, and the world rearranged itself. Celine stared at him. The mate bond. She could feel it. She understood now what the warmth was, the strange settling in her chest when his hands had touched her face, the way the noise in her head had gone quiet. She'd thought it was shock. She'd thought it was relief at Dorian releasing her arm. But it wasn't any of those things. It was the oldest magic there was. I'm nobody, she said softly, not self-pity, just honest bewilderment. I'm the daughter of a man who gambled away everything we had. I came here tonight to be sold. I don't understand why. Because the moon doesn't calculate worth the way people do, Zarel said simply. She doesn't look at bloodlines or debt or family reputation. She looks at something I don't have a better word for than rightness. He tilted his head slightly. And I have been waiting for you, though I didn't know your name, for 34 years. Celine's eyes filled again. Different tears this time. She wasn't sure she could have explained the difference to anyone who asked. I'm not asking you to trust me fully tonight, he continued. I know that's not something I've earned. I'm only asking if you're willing to try. If you'll let me, let this be a beginning. She thought about the cliff edge feeling she'd had all night, that sense of being pushed toward a fall she couldn't prevent. She thought about the fact that this was the first time all evening she had felt her own feet under her, solid on the ground. Yes, she said, the way you say a word when you mean every letter of it. Yes. I choose this. I choose you. The smile that broke over Zarel Ashbourne's face was not a king's smile. It was quieter than that, and a little surprised, the smile of a man who had prepared himself so thoroughly for loneliness that joy had caught him slightly off guard. He turned to the ceremony keeper, who was staring with his mouth open. We go first tonight, Zarel said. Before all other couples. By ancient rite of the true mate bond, his voice lifted to carry across the circle. I, Zarel Ashbourne, King of the Northern Territories, claim Celine Voss as my true mate, my queen, under the full moon and before all witnesses. By the law of the bond. By the will of the moon herself. The pack erupted. Not all at once. It started at the edges, a ripple of sound, stunned and then wondering and then, as the reality of what they'd witnessed settled in, joyful. Genuinely, openly joyful. The kind of collective feeling that only happens when a crowd watches something real and true and unexpected, something that reminds everyone watching that magic is not a ceremony. Magic is a king stepping off a dais for a crying girl, and the crying girl finding the courage to say no and then yes in the same breath. Lyra was definitely crying. Celine could hear it. She was probably crying too. She didn't bother checking. The Queen's chambers were not what Celine had expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, exactly, something grand and cold, maybe. Stone walls hung with tapestries depicting battles. The austere, impersonal beauty of rooms designed to impress rather than comfort. What she found instead was a fireplace the size of a doorway, burning low and amber, and a window that looked out over the entire valley, and a chair near that window with a book left open face down on its arm, as if someone had just stepped away mid-chapter and intended to return. It was, she realized, a room where someone actually lived. A servant had brought her here after the ceremony, after the formal declarations and the marking. She touched the place at her neck instinctively, still tender, still sending little sparks of warmth through the bond every time she thought about it. And after Zarel had been pulled aside by 3 different council members who apparently could not restrain themselves from having opinions about a king claiming a mate at the bonding moon without advance notice. Celine had watched his face during that. He'd been patient with the first one, precise with the second, and by the third had looked at them all with an expression that communicated, without a single word, that the conversation was finished. She found herself almost smiling at the memory. Almost, because she was still trembling slightly. Had been since the circle. She wasn't entirely sure it would stop. Her whole life had rearranged itself in the span of 1 hour, and her body hadn't caught up with the rearrangement yet, was still sending distress signals that no longer had anything to distress them, a fire alarm in an empty building. The door opened. Zarel came in and closed it quietly behind him. He'd removed the formal ceremonial mantle. Without it he looked, not smaller, nothing about him was small, but more human. Just a tall man in dark linen, with a bite mark on his own neck that mirrored hers, moving a little carefully the way you move when something significant has happened to your body and you're still adjusting to the new geography of yourself. He stopped when he saw her sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her white dress, moon flowers still braided into her hair, hands folded in her lap. "You're still shaking," he said. "I know. I think it'll pass. Do you want something? Food, tea, there's no pressure to." "I'm all right," she said. Then, because it was true and she was apparently in the business of saying true things tonight, "I'm frightened." "Not of you. I want to say that clearly, not of you. Just of, all of it. How quickly everything changed. I keep waiting for it to stop being real." He crossed the room and sat in the chair near the window, not beside her on the bed, not looming over her, but at a considered distance, close enough to talk, far enough to breathe. She appreciated it more than she knew how to say. "It's real," he said. "I can promise you that much. How are you so calm?" He looked at her for a moment. "I'm not," particularly a small pause. "I've waited 34 years for this. I've rehearsed every version of how a mate bond might feel when it finally happened. And then the actual experience was so much larger than any version I imagined that I think I'm still processing." Celine studied his face. The firelight made it easier to look at him directly than the moonlight had, or perhaps she was simply less terrified than she'd been an hour ago. She could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, earned not inherited, the kind that come from years of making hard decisions. She could see that his hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were not entirely still either. "You said 9 years," she remembered. "On the dais. That you'd presided for 9 years. "Yes. Every year without a mate. Every year." His voice was even, but not empty. There was something underneath the evenness that she recognized, the specific texture of a long, privately held sadness that has been kept so well managed for so long it barely has a surface anymore. Just depth. "I stopped expecting it to happen several years ago. That was easier than the alternative. The alternative being hoping. Hoping is expensive," he said. "When the return is uncertain." Celine looked at her hands. "I know something about that. I imagine you do." The fire settled and shifted. Outside the window the moon was still full and high, pouring silver over the valley, over the distant lights of the pack village where tonight's ceremony was still continuing, all 20 other couples, completing their bonds in a clearing that now contained the story of their king and his sudden, crying, unexpected queen. People would be talking about it for a long time. Celine knew that. She wasn't sure yet how she felt about being a story that people told. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." When you came down from the dais, she looked up. "You didn't know it was me, did you? You didn't know who I was before tonight?" "No, I knew your family name because Harkin mentioned it. But I didn't know you." He met her eyes steadily. "I came down because you were crying and his hand on your arm looked like a trap. The bond was, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the only possible direction I could move." Something flickered in his expression. "Is that frightening? That it wasn't reasoned?" She considered it honestly. 3 hours ago, yes. Right now it's the only part of tonight that makes sense to me." She exhaled. "The rest of it, the debts, my family, Dorian, that all feels enormous and complicated. But the part where you walked across the circle because you had to, that part one understand." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your mother and your sisters are being housed in the East Wing tonight. I had the steward arrange it before the council detained me." A pause. Your father is here as well. I thought you should know before you saw him. He's aware of the arrangement, of what Dorian did to you. Your mother told him. Another pause. He is not well, in the way that men who've caused harm and finally understand the shape of it are not well. Celine closed her eyes briefly. Her father. Corbin Voss, who had loved her in the distracted, slightly helpless way of men who love their families but love the card table with a more consistent attendance. Who had accumulated the debt that had become the chain around her neck. Who had shaken hands with Beta Harkin over a glass of wine and called it a good arrangement without asking his daughter what she thought of the man she'd be chained to. She was angry at him. She had been angry at him for months. She was also, underneath the anger, still his daughter. And that was a complicated country to inhabit. I'll see him tomorrow, she said. Tonight I can't. Of course, no argument. No suggestion that she should be forgiving, or gracious, or any of the things people always suggested women should be when hurt by the men who were supposed to protect them. Just of course. She filed that away somewhere private and warm. Then a knock at the chamber door, hard and official. Zarel rose with a slight tightening around his eyes. That will be Lord Fenwick, he said. The head of the Pack Council. He's been waiting to speak with me since the ceremony ended. About me? About protocol, mostly. The council has opinions about things being done in the correct order. The corner of his mouth moved. I have opinions about that too, as it happens. He opened the door. Lord Fenwick was a broad, silver-haired elder with the expression of a man who had been patient long past his natural limit. Behind him stood two other council members, equally pressed and equally displeased. Your Majesty, Fenwick's voice was carefully neutral. The council requests a moment to discuss the evening's irregularities before you retire. Lord Fenwick. Zarel's voice was pleasant. Perfectly pleasant, the way a very still sea is pleasant before you notice there's no wind at all. My mate has survived a difficult night. She is sitting 20 feet behind me. Any irregularities you'd like to discuss can wait until morning. Your Majesty, the proper order of bonding declarations requires that I care more about order than about her, Zarel finished. I don't. Morning. He closed the door. Celine stared at his back. You'll have to do that conversation eventually, she said. I will. Tomorrow. He turned. Tonight is yours. Whatever you need it to be. He glanced at the window, at the still full moon. Rest, if you can. Or don't. We can sit here until morning if that's what you need. I have no requirement of you except that you're safe. That word. Safe. She hadn't realized how hungry she'd been for it until he said it, hadn't realized how long she'd been moving through the world with her shoulders up around her ears, braced, constantly braced. The word safe hit her somewhere low in the chest and her eyes went very bright for a moment. She breathed through it. Can I ask one more thing?